Hello, and welcome back to the Battle Frontier podcast, where we aim to help you level up in your journey to improve as a competitive Pokemon TCG player. I'm Aaron Curry, a longtime player, took a break for quite a bit, but I've been back trying to get back into the swing of things. I've only been to a few majors in the past year and a half, but I'm looking to hit the ground running this season and keep improving. And over here, I've got my co host, John Orgel, who's been around the block almost as long as I have, but didn't take that break. So, John, how are we doing?
Oh, I'm great. I've been playing since 2011. Just a little bit about myself. Been playing since 2011. And once COVID happened, I switched over to a role as a judge, but I still love keeping my nose to the pulse. I know it's like mixing metaphors, but keeping my finger on the pulse of the competitive TCG as a
Sure.
whole, and I love just talking about it. So that's why we're definitely doing this little venture together, and hopefully it turns out really well.
You've been running the league up there in Virginia for a while. So, did you guys have anything cool going on this week? Any league challenges or anything?
The league was kind of quiet. We had our GLC night. We do that every last Monday of the month. So we did a. We usually run a tournament, but we only had 4 players doing GLC, so we just had open play. But over the weekend, I had the opportunity to play in a cup in Charlottesville, which is about an hour and 20 minutes from my house. And I played Reggie Drago VMAX and got second and lost to, if all y'all old heads out there know him, Johnny Rabus, longtime Richmond local. He's like, I think, got a top 16 or top 8 at Worlds at one point. But he was playing Raging Bolt, and that felt like it was my time to my tournament run was over when I hit him. So that's fair. But how was your weekend, man? How did you do any Pokemon, or was it more
I
about
did
family? Or?
actually. So
Yes.
we had the hurricane blew through.
Mm.
Thankfully for my sake, it was on the other side of the state, so weather over here wasn't all that bad. We did lose power for a little bit, had to pull out the generator and deal with all that, but
Mm.
got our power back and still had enough going on that went to a league challenge on Friday night. Did have a relatively small turnout, but I took a slightly modified version of our Palkia Dusknoir list from Baltimore. Dropped the trekking shoes to add in a second Irida, a fourth Duskull, and an Iron Bundle, just because I wanted to have another Gust in the deck and have it either be searchable or recoverable with Night Stretcher. The bundle was totally useless the whole night. Would not recommend it. But,
Okay.
you don't learn these things without trying them
No,
out.
yeah. And League
I
Challenge is
did
the
it.
perfect place for that.
Exactly. It's a great testing ground. I did manage to take that down. So, plus
Nice.
15 points into the void, probably. But, it's something.
Yeah.
It's something.
Boost your ego a little bit, yeah.
Yeah,
After
for sure.
yeah.
So one of the things we're going to kick this off with, though, is something a little more fun. Um, I believe John wanted to call this segment Blaine's Quiz Show. And so, John, can you explain what we're going to be doing here?
So yeah, I figured we just do a little fun trivia section. Shout outs to Xander Bennett for helping me think through this idea a little bit. He's a long time player, but also has gotten into being more of like the trivia host of the competitive TCG. So I just wanted to test your trivia knowledge of the competitive side of the Pokemon trading card game, Aaron. See how
Okay.
much you remember. So I have a mix of some old questions and some kind of new questions. And I just want to see. We had Ian take this earlier. He got 2 out of the 3. So if you can beat that, that's the goal. Is beat Dead Broke
Okay.
Nerd
And,
in
Ian's only been in the
trivia.
game for a little bit over a year, so I think I've got a pretty good shot.
All right,
There.
great, love it. All right, so your first question. It's all multiple choice. I figured I'd give you a little bit easier to start. Um, so the question is, which A-Spec trainer does not have a limitless page, meaning it has not made day 2 at a regionals or greater?
Okay.
Is it Dangerous Laser, Poke Vital A, Grand Tree, or Neutralization Zone?
Okay, so this one's going to be pretty easy, and I can run down which events I believe that all of these things have made day 2 at, except for the one that's the answer. So I know Dangerous Laser made day 2 at Worlds in somebody's Iron Thorns list.
Okay.
Grand Tree just made day 2 at Dortmund in a pretty interesting Dust Noir deck. And Neutralization Zone, I believe, was also at Worlds. But if it wasn't at Worlds, it was in Baltimore. So my answer for this is going to be Pokevital A
Good
because
powers
that
of
card is
deduction.
terrible.
You got it right. Yeah, it was tougher than I thought. I was like, oh, there's got to be some terrible ace specs that um, people haven't really even tried playing, but like dangerous lasers out there, man. It's so
It
funny.
is. It is. If you had pulled out something like Crystal Wall or
Mm-hmm.
Victory Piece or something, I
I
may
thought
have
about
gotten a
that.
little bit more tripped up. I
All right. Well,
think
I
one
figured
of
I'd
those
start you with
diggity.
an easy one. The next
Sure.
question might be a little bit harder for someone that's been out of the game for a little bit.
Okay.
So, who was the last Masters player to win back-to-back regionals? Is it Andrew Hendrick, Piper Lapine, Azul Garcia Griego, or Tord Reklev?
Okay. So this is the most recent back to back.
Mm-hmm.
That is tough. I know Andrew did it with Lugia, but I believe that was 2 seasons ago. And I know Azul won 2 regionals last year, or he might have actually done 3. But I think the answer is Azul, and I'm pretty sure they were both Charizard wins. So I think that's what I'm going to go with.
Okay, so just to fact check you, Azul only won one regional last
Oh,
year.
damn.
San Antonio, I believe, Texas. The correct answer is Andrew Hedrick.
Damn.
I know he's the last one to do it for quite some time,
Sure.
especially like it's been Piper. I think actually had a gap in her regional wins. I think there was
Okay.
one North American regional between her 2 wins, but still impressive.
Gotcha. I'm
All
going to
right,
counter
last
your fact check, by the way, real quick,
yeah.
before we move to question 3. Azul did win 2 regionals last year because he also won Stockholm. But I understand those aren't back to
Oh,
back.
also, yeah, I forgot about Stockholm. Good man. Yeah, with Snorlax. That's right.
Yes,
That's yeah. It's just one of those things I kind of erase Snorlax from my memory if I can help it.
most people
Anyway,
would. Most
all right.
people would.
Question 3. What company ran a supplemental circuit series between 2006 or 2016 and 2017? Was it Full Grip, Top Cut Comics, Yeti Gaming, or Altered Reality Games?
I actually do not know the answer to this, so this is
Oh,
going to be
that's
a
so
total shot in the
interesting.
dark.
All right, can I? I'm
this
gonna
was
have you.
this was
I'm gonna have
the
you guess, and then I'm gonna give you a hint.
okay. So this was my son was born in 2016 and had a lot of stuff going on over that next 2 years, as any other new parent would relate to. But I'm gonna say it's not Yeti Gaming, even though Vince's story is great. I don't think it was them. I want to say my gut is that it was either Top Cut Comics or ARG, and I think I'm gonna go with ARG. I
You
don't know
got it
why,
right.
but
You
that's
got
what's
it
okay.
right. Yeah.
Sweet.
So, um, yeah, it's so you tied Dead Broke Nerd. Fair enough. But yeah, just a little touch on ARG. I've competed in some of those tournaments, and I actually got second in their invitational for 2017. I had
Okay,
the trophy. That's what I was looking for earlier.
gotcha.
So maybe I can bring it out another time. But yeah. So and I think friends of the cast. I think Grafton might have been sponsored. No, it was Jose Maria, and I think they sponsored Kyle and Ryan Sable House.
Okay,
So a lot of players, Grant Manley, a lot of players in that area were sponsored by
sure.
them. They were one of the first people to sponsor Pokemon players.
So this was like the pre DDG era.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, cool. This was fun.
Yeah.
It's something that we're gonna try to bounce back and forth on this, so it won't always just be John trying to quiz me. I'm gonna come up with questions for him as well, and hopefully I can come up with some information that's as challenging and interesting as the questions that John posed for me this week. But that being said, we're gonna jump now and look at some of the regional events that happened this weekend. There were 2 regional tournaments. Neither of them were NA, and I personally wasn't crossing the pond or going down south for either of these events, but we had events over in Dortmund, Germany, as well as down in Joinville. The first thing we'll look at here are just some of the meta breakdown, meta statistics for Dortmund, and this doesn't give you the full picture. This isn't just the day 2 statistics. So the first thing we may want to look at here are just the official stream graphics. Shoutouts to Robin over at Limitless, who has compiled all of this information into a nice, easily digestible format, and including the importing of these stream graphics from the stream so you don't have to go hunt them down yourself anymore, which is a really neat touch and something that I just discovered today. So we look at, to my surprise, after the abysmal performance that it had in Baltimore as far as conversion rate goes, Raging Bolt managed to increase its popularity in the field and become the number 1 deck at 17%. Ty Charizard, and then we see the rise of Dragapult thanks to that Sparkling Crystal Ace spec. Regidrago has a pretty big fall off. Lugia still sits roughly about where it was, still in the top 5. Gardevoir still hangs out in that, low, like 5 to 8% range. And then we look at the best of the rest graphic. We see the appearance of Terapagos, the only real breakout card aside from that Sparkling Crystal Ace pack from this new set. Roaring Moon still hanging out. Miraidon still hanging out. Other Turbo decks. And then, of course, the contingent of small but loyal stall Snorlax players. And Ancient Box is still here for some reason. Those are probably just people that are hanging on, not really knowing what they want to transition to. And so we jump over and we get to see how did those things transition into day 2. And the big story, from my perspective, is that Terapagos just kind of exploded and converted almost, I believe, 30 to 35% of the players that were playing Terapagos converted into day 2. Wow. Giving themselves the lion's share of this day 2 meta percentage as the number 1 deck. Raging Bolt actually, interestingly, does convert fairly well here, still holding on at almost the same percentage it was at in day 1. Charizard is a bit of a drop-off. Regidrago gets on the come-up along with Lugia. Dragapult falls off pretty hard. And then Gardevoir maintains itself almost exactly where it was percentage-wise. Snorlax jumps up a little bit. Iron Thorns jumps up a little bit. I believe previously it was in the unclassified category. Miraidon still maintains a low percentage. Banette jumps out of the unclassified category, this time paired with Gardevoir rather than Dusknoir. And then we see my favorite deck in the world, Palkia Dusknoir, make an appearance on the graphic as its own deck. So, John, what do you make of these, before we look at the overall results, what do you think of this day 1 to day 2 shift?
I'm surprised that there was so little Terapagos played day 1.
Sure.
I thought usually when you see a new set, everybody wants to play with the new cards, and it's interesting that people are so reluctant to try something else. Like I remember when Palkia first came out, and like there was the Australian tournament where like I think the top 8 were all Palkia.
Yep.
And so it is interesting. Like, and you usually do have a significant advantage playing new cards that people aren't familiar with. Like they haven't tested the matchup as much, just because the cards haven't been out. So it is interesting that there's only a 5% meta share for that Terapagos deck day 1. But it is not too surprising that it does convert pretty well. You have that unexpected factor, and it has a pretty good power level. And I know you like seeing that Dusknoir paired next to it. So it definitely, I think that's my biggest thing. And then going back to that first slide, looking at conversion rates, it is interesting to me that it's more of the same as what we've seen. And I was surprised that Raging Bolt did convert as well as it did. Looking at the day 1 to day 2 from Baltimore, Raging Bolt, I think, basically fell off the face of the map.
Right.
So we do see either the meta has gotten more favorable for Raging Bolt, or more top players might be picking it up, or maybe just it had a friendly environment, I guess, with all the Terapagos, or with all like maybe more big basic decks like Lugia, like Dragapult. I could see that having a good Dragapult matchup.
Sure.
Anything that's it might be better into that than like say a Gardevoir or a Ancient Box. So it is. I guess maybe the meta was finally good for that deck moving into this tournament.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that it didn't actually fall off harder. Historically, Raging Bolt has had a really bad Charizard matchup. I know that has potentially shifted if the players were including Briar to kind of level things out a little bit. But with the fall off of Regidrago, which was something that Raging Bolt kind of held as a cornerstone positive matchup, or ideally positive matchup, having that go down, maybe it kind of does get replaced by the Terapagos a little bit. I think the point you made about good players playing a deck, making it convert well, really sticks out with the Terapagos play, because we see players like the Schultz brothers, like Tord, like Grant Manley showing up with this Terapagos deck and probably, like you said, having experience in matchups that other people are unfamiliar with, being able to convert this relatively powerful card into a position to allow themselves to make day two. And so if we want to go over now and look over at just the top 8 results from this event, we see the interesting thing. We had this nice rule change from TPCI this season where players from APAC or the TPC regions are able to actually receive invites if they win TPCI events, even though they will not receive championship points. And thus, with Ryuki Okada taking this event down with this Dragapult Dusknoir deck, he's got himself a Worlds invite now, where in any other previous season that wouldn't be the case. And that's honestly really cool to see. And this deck list is rather unique when we look at it here in just a second. And the other kind of big highlight thing here in this top 8 bracket is that Rahul Reddy makes his 3rd top cut appearance in a row at 3 consecutive major events.
It's wild.
And then on top of that, he's playing the same list that he started piloting at Worlds. So 3 different events, 2 different formats, not a single card changed in this deck.
Yeah, and I watched his VOD today, and he went over like his whole tournament run. And he talked about like he tried putting in some new stuff from the set. I think he tried what was it? I think the Ogre Pawn action. So he was using like the teal mask, or not teal mask, the Cornerstone Seal and the Wellspring Mask, and trying that out on Lugia. And he was just like, the more I kept playing it, the more I just wanted, like he wanted to go back to what he knew. He tried out some new decks, and he just came back to Lugia, and I can't honestly blame him. I mean, if it's the deck that got you to top 8, and I mean, respect that you're trying stuff out, because it is a new format. It's just smart to do that.
Sure.
Especially, I'm sure he's got the great resource of having such a great testing group. Something that's, I think, very instrumental to the success of a lot of great players in this era right now. And you have that great resource. You want to like find something new, but kind of bring what got you there in some sense. So
sure. At what point do Bradner and the rest of the members of the testing group jump on this Lugia list? Honestly, they've all been trying to force these Reggie Drago decks through, and they've had success here and there, but nothing that really matches Rahul's Lugia success. So maybe it's time to jump on board, guys.
I think Lugia is a hard sell to most competitive players.
Oh, totally.
Because it feels yeah, I mean, you and I feel have the same kind of attitude about it, where we're just like, I don't feel like gambling to determine my fate at a tournament, and I feel like Lugia can get that way, and we saw that in the finals of the regionals here, with Rahul going against Ryuki, and he had game 1 was playable, but game 2 Lugia just bricked, and like it was like classic like Lugia syndrome of just like, it just looked like you were just playing a theme deck, and like all the basic energies came out, all the Pokemon that you can't play, you got the aroma like the aroma flips didn't go your way, Meza goes a flip, all that kind of stuff, and it's just like, guess we lose. And I think that's such a hard pill to swallow for a lot of players, especially when like you're traveling to a tournament in another country, and you're trying to like position yourself to have a deep run. Are you really going to like leave it up to chance? And it's interesting that Rahul has made it, and I think he even said this, and his whole thing was just like, he's just gotten lucky, and he's like, I'm waiting for the wheels to fall off and to me just go back to being like that player that doesn't make day 2s or whatever. But I think he's actually just, he just made a breakthrough. He's found the deck that keeps giving him consistent success. And we've seen that with other players. We saw that with Jesse Parker last year with Miraidon. We've seen it with Andrew Hedrick, although he's won it with a couple different decks. But we see those kind of, some players just find the deck that, that they can succeed with, and that they can play better than anybody else. And they have that confidence to go into the room and say, it's my tournament to lose.
And we can actually see that. We can see that in this event too. If we just go down to the 3rd place, and you look at Yella Van Kampen with the Golden Go, Golden Go's strongest warrior at this point, I would say.
100%.
Yella's been rocking Golden Go for quite a long time and having continued success. No wins thus far, but a second at Dortmund last year, a third place here. It's something you can't really complain about, especially with a deck that most people write off as a meme or tier 2 or whatever. It's definitely pretty cool to see.
Yeah, it really is. It's. I mean, he was fun to watch on stream too. I don't know if you watched any of his games, but I think in his
Sure.
top four
Yeah, he
or
did the
his
whole make it rain
yeah,
motion.
yeah, and the casters loved it, and it's hard
Of
not to
course.
cheer for a guy like that, you know.
Yeah, he's got a lot of great energy.
Hmm.
Moving down, we've got Stefan Ivanov playing the Palkia Dust Noir deck. Um, Jan Hausman. Apologies if I butcher anybody's name, by the way. But with Raging Bolt, Stephen Law on Iron Thorns, and there are some interesting things about these decks. We will pull up the list and go through them shortly. Glenn Bowens on Maridon, James DeBoer on Lugia. Tord was actually originally part of the top 8 and lost in the asymmetrical cut to Ryuki, but Tord playing Terapagos Dust Noir. And I believe this asymmetrical cut actually went down to 11 or 12.
It was.
I know it was more than 9,
It might
but
have been 12.
so then we also have rounding out that cut Johan Barjazak on Reggie Drago, Tom Cedric Hins on Raging Bolt, and Giorgio Gatti on with the Dragapult Pidgeot deck. And so if we go through now, we can just pull up some of these deck lists for the top cut individual specifically. And let's start with the deck that won the event. So we've got Ryuki Okada's Dragapult Dustomer deck. And interestingly, Ryuki cuts the Pidgeot out here, thickens up the Dustomer and Dragapult lines, and just says, I'm not going to get 3 different stage 2s out. I'm going to stick with these 2, keep things as streamlined, consistent as possible, play the new additions that make this deck stronger in Crispin and Sparkling Crystal, chooses to actually exclude Briar, as the Temple of Sinnoh, which was probably pretty helpful in that Lugia matchup throughout the tournament. And just we see the continued success of these, not continued success rather, but the success of the alternative sort of stage 2 decks that come out of Japan, where they like to include these 2 copies of Rotom V as a major consistency tool, recognizing that you need to set up to play the game when you're playing something that's a stage 2 deck. There's a few other interesting things here. We've got the Tatsugiri. Japan's always been a big fan of that. If we go back and look at Kato Arise, Gardevoir deck from NAIC last year, on top of just a suite of consistency cards. I mean, when you cut out the extra stage 2s, you get the room to make your deck look more consistent. Who would have thought?
Yeah, and I mean, not running Pidgeot is. I mean, you look at any other. I think it was this Ryuki and one other player at 22nd that's also from Japan.
Sure.
That were playing. They were playing.
Oh, it was Kato.
Kato, yeah. They were both playing the same list,
Yep.
and then they were the only Dragapult Dusknoir decks that made day 2 that were not running Pidgeot.
Correct.
And it is fascinating to see. I think sometimes people the Japanese players don't know what they're doing. They're just kind of doing their own thing or whatever. So it's reassuring and it's cool in my mind to see a player come all the way from Japan and say, no, we know what we're doing. You guys, you can build decks your own way, and we have our own sense of stuff. We run the second Rotom over a heavy ball or something like that. And I think that's really cool to see that
Sure.
there's innovation in the game, that there's different flavors of it. I wouldn't go so far as to say there's different play styles, but I mean, there's definitely different innovations going on in different parts of the world, which is really cool.
Yeah, there's different. I definitely wouldn't call it a play style thing. I think that there are different deck building preferences between regions, and that really shows here how big of a difference it can make in your tournament run. We can pull up Rahul's list real quick. I'm sure everybody's seen it several times at this point.
Yeah.
The same Lugia Archeops deck, 1/1 Cinccino line, with the Raikou, with the Earthen Vessel, with the basic Lightning. The list is good.
Is this just the way to play Lugia right now? Like, is this how we all should be playing it? Like, I mean,
think it's hard to argue at this point. As long as
basic...
I would say, I think if the meta stays the way it is now, I would be on board with that. I think that you could make an argument for making the Cinccino line thicker if the meta calls for it to be that way.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm not a Lugia expert by any means.
Right,
I don't know what that meta would look like, but
I would want to hear Raul's take on it. I mean, he obviously thought it was good enough going into this meta. And there's definitely a lot of flexibility with the second lightning and the Raikou V. You have a lot of good stuff going into some matchups that you would have a hard time normally. Like helps so much in the mirror, helps so much against like Area Zero, like a Palkia deck, anything like that. Having that Raikou, being able to just kind of thread easy knockouts on your opponent's side.
Sure. We can pull up Yella's deck for the individuals that would be interested in this. If you are playing Goldengo, I would almost say assuredly that this is the way to play Goldengo.
Mm-hmm.
There are a couple of card counts here that, from the consistency fiend in me, are off-putting, like the single Pokestop. But I guess when you have 3 Cypher Maniacs, you can kind of get away with a call like that. And you're using it almost more as a counter stadium than anything, or just giving yourself the ability to kind of churn through and draw additional cards. I think the rest of this looks pretty par for the course for Goldengo at this point, honestly.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's no Super Rod. The only recovery is the Night Stretchers. But yeah, everything else is kind of interesting. Like, yeah, I don't think there's anything that's revolutionary at this point. 6 water for lightning seems right. It just seems weird. Like, looks in at my eyes, like, oh, you're attacking with metal energy. You should be running more of those. But I think you definitely want to see more water early so you can discard it and use Palkia's ability when you need to.
Yeah.
So
if you need that Moonlight Shuriken, then you definitely need to have the waters dumped early.
Right.
Stefan's list. I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about this one either. If you go watch episode 0, if you know, you know. But if you go watch episode 0, you'll see I talk about this deck at length there. This is essentially the same list that we played in Baltimore. Just has the Irida in place of the Rotom, and Stefan is playing the quote-unquote good Duskulls. I still don't own these Duskulls, so I will not be putting them in my deck.
Yeah, I don't think you're going to lose games by not owning them. I think that's
right.
I mean, sure, like Pokemon players love that, don't they?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, you're min-maxing on the nichest of scenarios, and that absolutely, I will admit, that could win or lose you some number of games in your tournament run. But I'm not sweating it at this point. The funny thing, the one thing I will,
if you're running, sorry, go ahead.
I was just the one thing I will say about this list is that it actually is the exact list that we had the night before Baltimore, and the -1 Irida +1 Rotom was a decision that we made that night. So somehow, independently, the French group that Stefan led in choosing this deck list arrived at the exact same 60 as us on entirely different parts of the world. That's pretty cool to see that.
Yeah, it is very cool. I don't think the Dusknoir matters as much in this because you're not running Psychic Energy. I think it does matter a little bit more in Dragapult, where you're able to attack with it and potentially confuse your opponent's Pokemon.
Yeah. I could see that in either this or Banette Dusknoir. I think the argument people make against the Shrouded Fable Duskull is if someone puts up a Mew with a Defiance Band, they can kill you in one hit. And I think if I'm in a matchup in a scenario where that is happening, I've probably already lost the game. But
or they're putting a Mew up. They're putting a Mew up for you to, like, they're taking a 1-prize knockout, and you're able to get a return KO on a 2-prizer that has 3 energies attached to it. That usually 3 energies is a pretty steep commitment to a squishy 2-prizer like that. So I'm like, okay, maybe I just bait them into taking that knockout, and now I'm in a much better spot than I was the turn before. Right. Anyway, not to get bogged down in hypothetical scenarios.
Jan brings out the kind of evolved version of the what was hyped going into Worlds of the Raging Bolt with Dusknoir, but also including the Briar from Stellar Crown. This also looks like a pretty stock Raging Bolt list at this point. I wasn't totally surprised to see people wanting to play this because of not Stellar Crown, the Champions League results with Raging Bolt winning that event. I thought some of them might be scared off by how poorly it did in Baltimore, but it is a new format. People want to add new things, try new things, and, it's Raging Bolt. It's pretty straightforward. You slam your cards, you do big damage.
Yeah, do you like the Dusknoir in this?
No, I actually don't think it really adds anything. But,
well, I think you kind of need it.
Okay, sorry, I shouldn't say that. I think it's exactly. It's cute with the Briar, but 90% of the time your opponent's going to be on a 2/2/2 map against your deck anyway, so it really doesn't make that big of a difference.
Right.
Next up is Stephen Law's Iron Thorns deck, which is relatively actually different, and I'm not sure if it's in a good way. What do you think about this? The inclusion of non-Iron Thorns Pokemon in the Iron Thorns deck.
I think it's a smart pivot. I think we've seen players adapt to being able to knock out Iron Thorns or like have an answer. I don't think it does enough to convince me that it's probably the way to go forward, but I honestly haven't tried it yet. I'm kind of curious if it does open up matchups. Like maybe he's looking at his matchup spread. And he's just like, oh, well, I have a hard time against Charizard if they get, set up turn one or turn two before I can,
Sure.
for whatever reason. So maybe he puts in Mimikyu and Cornerstone Seal just to shore that matchup up. So it is just like a meta call, and I think that's any good anti-meta player is gonna like read what's the expected meta going into the event and go from there.
Sure.
Yeah, but I don't know. I think it is kind of an interesting like, is this make it better? Does it make it like a better deck to have more? I mean, it's kind of cool. You can attack with both of them with the legacy energy, so you can just kind of go solo, like Cornerstone Seal,
Sure.
and then like keep penny looping it potentially. Well, not keep penny looping it because you don't run Pal Pad, but get some value out of it for sure with that energy.
The thing that scares me are matchups where you do want to go straight Thorns and you open not Thorns, which is not
Right.
a low percentage of the time. And then your opponent, until you find that penny, your opponent has the ability to gust out of your Thorns lock. That's the one thing that kind of puts me off of wanting to do that. I do like the nods of respect toward Terapagos in the inclusion of the enhanced hammer, the inclusion of the extra stadium bump for area 0 underdepths. But at the end of the day, like you said, it's kind of a meta call deck. It's similar to how we saw the Noivern deck pop up in Baltimore. I think Iron Thorns will continue to be that moving forward. And if we do continue to see Lugia be as successful as it has been, maybe Iron Thorns is a better play than people are giving it credit for.
Yeah.
Next up is another deck people kind of hyped up going into this event. Thanks to that Area 0 inclusion in this nice Terra Mewtwo, we see this enhanced or evolved Miraidon list from Glenn Bowens. And this honestly still just kind of looks like a pretty stock Miraidon list for Stellar Crown. You
There's
get
some
the
interesting
extra
things.
you get the extra Miraidon, you get the extra Raikou. The Raichu is different. I will totally give him that. That is something that people have been cutting en masse, and now we see it kind of pop back in. One thing that I don't see here that I thought had the potential to be interesting would be either an extra copy of Zapdos, or I've also seen people including a 1/1 or 2/2 Regieleki VMAX in the deck to help you be able to one-hit KO things. So instead of the Raichu, they're adding these extra damage modifiers to be able to hit those higher numbers on specific Pokemon.
He does run a Vitality Band. I think that kind of
Sure.
accomplishes the same thing as that Zapdos. He's running. I think the interesting things are he's got a lot beefier of a Pokemon line, which makes a lot of sense with Area 0. He still has like one state Academy at Night, which I thought was interesting. So I guess he's not giving up on the whole. I can just make my generators guaranteed at least one energy, which is kind of cool. But I don't know how much value that is. I don't really know. But the secret box is what is fascinating to me. I guess when you have that option to get a different stadium with secret box, you can go Arvin for secret box, and then get secret box, get the stadium, get a tool, get an item card, and get so you can get your generator, the Academy at Night. Go ahead and
Sure.
do the whole combo. Put it up with the skateboard or rescue board. Sorry, something else. And then so you have a little bit more guarantee. So it doesn't just it might not boost consistency as much, but it like boosts the strategic, or it decreases variance, I should say. So like
Right.
you have a more guaranteed, like I just need one energy to get the KO here, and I don't want to like have all my generators just be coin flips. So like the 15 energy is a little lower than what we've been seeing, I'd say,
Yep.
at Worlds and after Worlds at Baltimore. So I think you got to kind of pivot strategies a little bit. You use Raikou V, which is like a less energy intensive attacker. So you don't necessarily need as many energies. But you still have a hand centric, like Iron Hands centric gameplay. So you still need some energy hits early and often. So it's an interesting take on the list. It's a little bit different than what I've seen for some people. I think a lot of people were just playing Jesse's list, like minus a couple cards and putting in the Mewtwo in the stadiums. So this definitely adds a little bit of flair to that. So it's cool to see some innovation.
Okay, yeah, I mean that's totally fair, and something that I expect with some of the cards we have coming up from Surging Sparks. We get a nice Mewtwo's time in the sun is relatively
Yeah.
short lived, since we do get a one retreat Electric Terra Pokemon coming out with the Pikachu EX. That'd be a nice upgrade to the deck, and I think like you called out, the Academy at Night is a little interesting here when you with the decreased energy count, you want to make your generators more consistent by making your board wider, faster. So I would think that you almost always want to have Area Zero in play early on. I guess maybe Academy at Night is more of a mid-late game thing, but obviously it worked out for Glenn, and congrats, top eight, no
Yeah,
easy feat.
just real quick, you can always bump your own area zero with that
Sure,
stadium, and
sure.
then like if you've got like a bravery charmed Iron Hands that just gets damaged by something for like 200 220, you can then just clear all that damage off, which is such a huge thing in that deck. So it gives you a little more strategy to work with.
Yeah, that's fair. Totally fair. Having extra stadium bumps is never a bad thing. I mean, maybe it also gives you a little bit more counterplay into that Terapagos matchup. We have James DeBoer on a more standard Lugia list. Still a slightly slimmed down Cinchino line. Nobody's wanting to make that jump back up to 3-3. The big interesting card here is kind of the slept on powerhouse of the format, in
Mm,
my opinion, and that is Klefki. I think that if someone figures out the way to break this card and keep their deck consistent while doing it, they will probably win the next event. Personally,
hmm.
Klefki is a monster right now, especially into all these turbo decks. I mean, every stage 2 deck runs Rotom, runs Luminion. Almost every deck runs Pheasantipity. A lot of these turbo decks. I mean, we see the Squawkabilly in James's deck. Squawkabilly has become a mainstay in Lugia. Squawkabilly is a guaranteed inclusion in all of the turbo decks. A lot of these fast Dusknoir decks are playing Squawkabilly. You also shut down Fan Rotom in the Terapagos deck. So Klefki is really, really strong, and I think it's being kind of underrated right now.
Agreed. And it is interesting to see like we're moving like now that we don't have a Cardi dominant meta, we're trying to put Klefki in different decks,
Right.
and we're seeing it in Lugia. We're seeing it. I mean, I don't know. I guess I haven't really seen it too many other places, to be honest.
No, and that's the problem.
Yeah.
a lot of a lot of decks don't have the ability to easily pivot into it on turn 1 because
Mm-hmm.
they're either running low energy counts or their starters have more than one retreat cost, so it's hard for them to move into it. Or
Yeah.
they're not a deck that wants to wait a turn and hide behind it, so they don't really care.
Yeah, and having the Thornton's really cool
Yeah,
with Klefki because like Klefki is really really good early game, and then its value diminishes as the game goes on, and you just need to
of
get your
course.
attackers out. And now you have okay, I can Thornton back out one of the Mencinos and evolve it into a Cinchino, and then you run the Night Stretcher to combo with it too. So I think this is a cool list. Yeah, 3 mist is. I think we're seeing a lot more mist coming into Lugia decks. Just as Dragapult comes into the format more.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, I think everything else is pretty typical. Don't think there's anything too crazy that is like
Yeah,
shouting at me.
the only other thing that would jump out at me that I think, because I'm pretty sure Rahul has it, is that I think Lugia is a 4 boss deck at this point.
Oh yeah, the 3 was it
But yeah,
3
I'm
bosses
pretty
kind of
sure
crazy.
if I come back here, I mean 3 boss has been standard for quite a while, up until the past couple of formats. But yeah, Rahul has 4 boss
Mm,
here, and that's how Lugia closes out 90% of its games.
true.
Is just bossing around the big thing to either take the knockout with a Blood Moon Ursaluna or take the knockout with an Iron Hands or something to that effect. And being able to offset your prize trade with Legacy and then follow up with that knockout is pretty important. Next, we get to look at our first Terapagos deck of the event, and with Tord Reklev here. running almost like a merge, I would say, of the kind of tank Terrapagos with just the fast Dusknoir Terrapagos decks. I'm personally not a fan of Buffalant. I get that it's got some merit to being used for Mirror or for Charizard, which can be, Mirror is obviously difficult. That's almost entirely a coin flip matchup, as it, oftentimes should be or would be. Buffalant being able to offset that is kind of interesting, even though they can potentially just Dusknoir your Buffalant and it doesn't really make a difference. Um, Charizard, obviously, it makes a much larger difference being able to let your Terrapagos survive hits up until you've taken 4 prize cards, and that's a relatively big deal. But I'm not sure if it's worth the 2 spots, in my opinion. A lot of times you don't have the bench space to put them down throughout the
Yeah.
game.
Or if one's prized, it just loses its value
Right.
immediately.
Right.
I don't think it's terrible. I mean, if they're like if you the play you said were in the mirror, if they're using Dusknoir to KO your Buffalon, that means they're not using Dusknoir to set up math on a 2 prizer. So that's pretty good. And yeah, um, I think this is kind of standard Tord practice of doing the 1/1 Pidgeot with a Thornton. We
Yep.
saw that in his Baltimore list. He ran Pidgeot control, I think. Yeah. And so this is kind of a pivot version of that in some ways. There's some, no, there's not a lot of control aspects, but it's pretty aggressive looking. But you do have a counter catcher, which is nice. Yeah, I guess that makes sense. And then yeah, the only recovery being the night stretcher, which makes a lot of sense if you don't run any
Right.
basic energy. He's not running anything other than the 4 double turbo energy, which is I think smart. There's not any real threat of that coming back to bite you. If your opponent plays the Sinnoh down, then you have the stadium response. So yeah, I think this list makes a lot of sense to me. It's able to utilize, or it's able to abuse the Blood Moon Ursaluna really well. And yeah, I don't know. I don't think that this first Tord, it's like one of those things like Tord always has that great quality where like you might not know how to play a list, and then he plays the deck, and then you're like, okay, yeah, that's not the standard because now we've determined that like whatever Tord does is generally like he spent the most time prepping for this tournament. I'd say more. I mean, maybe we don't know. I'm assuming, but he's put the effort in, put the time in to figure out the optimal list for the tournament, and I think this is pretty close to that. I think, yeah, you could make the argument like, hey, maybe Buffalant's not needed or not optimal, but if he said like, well, if I'm expecting a lot of Mirror, if I'm expecting a lot of Charizard, and there was a good amount of Charizard at this tournament, then I think yeah, it does help in those matchups, like you said.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, there's some merit to the card at times. I
Yeah,
think in your general matchup spread, it's not winning you more games than it's doing nothing, though. But we'll see moving forward, I guess.
yeah,
We
for
do
sure.
see Reggie Drago pop up here. Oh, give me 1 second, John.
You're good.
There we go. Okay. We do see Reggie Drago pop up here, played by Yuan Barjazak. Um, this just looks like Reggie Drago.
Yeah, no Gudra in this one.
Sure.
Um, he's only running the 2 rod, which I think Bradner was running for the longest time, and I think that's kind of become the popular way to do it. Running 3 Iono instead of that Gudra, I believe
Instead
that's
of 2, right?
yeah. That's probably like the only real changes I've seen. I think a lot of players going into this tournament and at this tournament were cutting down to 1 Dragapult, but
Yes.
I like having the 2. Like it's honestly the attacker you use like 80% of the turns that you attack with Regidrago V Star. And so like not having access to that term 2 is so painful. And you just need, and just being able to discard it like from your opening hand or from your second hand with a vessel with an ultra ball naturally, is just so much better than sweating it trying to find it with the V Star ability, because that's
Sure.
not recommended.
No, no. Obviously, you want to hold on to that as long as possible. But fortunately, no Stellar Crown cards. Deck's not that interesting, in my opinion.
Hmm.
If we can
No.
move on. We do see another copy of Raging Bolt coming in at the asymmetric portion of Top Cut. Choosing to use Slitherwing, right? Yeah,
Yep.
Slitherwing, rather than Sandy Shocks as the one prizer of choice. Um, Better in the Iron Thorns matchup, worse in almost
Good
every other
against
matchup. I guess the other thing
Terraphagos.
you call out is that it can, yes, exactly. It can one hit KO the turtle. I don't know how often that's coming up. You should generally be wanting to one hit KO the turtle with your Raging Bolt anyway.
Yeah.
I guess the interesting thing here is a lot of other people, like we saw the Champions League list, did cut Ultra Ball completely. The other top 8 list ran one Ultra Ball. A lot of people have been trying to cut that card down in the deck, and personally, that scares me. I've tried running a few games with Raging Bolt, despite the fact that I don't find it to be the most enjoyable deck to play, and I don't know how people set up when they only play 4 ball cards. I don't see it. But
Yeah.
if you draw well enough, then hats off to you.
Yeah. I think the Sinnoh is interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I guess just to help your Lugia matchup, that could be a challenging matchup if they're able
Sure.
to abuse Weird Ear and abuse
Well, just playing around the legacy energy in general,
that
shutting off
too.
gift, like
Yeah.
things like that. We also see the bravery charms here as a nod to try to improve your matchup against the Dust Noir decks.
Yeah.
But other than that,
Pretty
Raging Bolt
pretty
lists.
cool. Yeah.
And the last one we've got is a another Dragapult deck, this time with Pidgeot, as is expected from most Western players. And but we do still see the kind of Japanese influence in the second Rotom being included. So we've got the thinner Dust
Mm.
Noir line. Wait, there's a Dracloak that was cut to fit in this 2-2 Pidgeot, 2-0-2, I should say. Still no Briar. League Headquarters is an interesting inclusion. Other than that, like obviously the big things that made Dragon Ball work, we didn't really highlight this when we talked about the list earlier, but Crispin being added to the deck as a means of energy acceleration as well as functioning as a pseudo energy search to be able to fully power up a Phantom Dive in one turn, along with that Sparkling Crystal that you can Arven for. The things that make Dragapult viable in this format when it wasn't viable as a pure Dragapult deck in previous formats are the fact that you can more easily get into your big attacker on turn 2.
Yeah. I
But a
think
lot of this, I mean, does anything from this, I know that you play quite a few online events or monitor them pretty closely. Does this look
yeah.
pretty standard from those kind of results?
Yeah, I'd say so. I don't think I played much Dragapult, but yeah, I think it's so interesting to compare this list to what won. You look at like the Pokemon lines; they're so much thinner. Like 2
Sure.
1 1 Dusknoir line, the 4-2-3 Dragapult line was opposed to like the 4-3. I think
Mm-hmm.
4-3-3 was
Yep.
the winning one. You get to see like where the cuts had to be made for the Pidgeot line,
Mm-hmm.
and like
There's
just
no
running
Radiant
tests.
Alakazam.
No Radiant Pokemon at all. Not
Mm-hmm.
even Radiant Charizard in this, which I think makes sense. I've heard a lot of Dragon Ball players complain about starting one of those two,
Sure.
and just not being able to play the game because of that. You don't see any switch cards in this, so other than a rescue board,
Right.
which isn't just kind of a pseudo switch. So yeah, you don't really have any way to get it out of the active outside of attaching and retreating. So yeah, that could be really, really damaging. But yeah, I think this is pretty standard from what I've seen the last few weeks.
Cool. So that'll round out Dortmund for us. Well, let's jump over to Joinville, which, like I mentioned earlier, unfortunately wasn't streamed. Um, Still had a relatively healthy number of players. 578 is, I believe, pretty standard for South American events that aren't ICs. And we see, pretty big Charizard dominance, as expected from Brazil. They generally have a pretty strong Charizard contingent. Raging Bolt continues to be successful. Terrapago's converted fairly well. Regidrago was up a little bit. Snorlax was up a lot percentage-wise compared to Dortmund.
Mm.
Iron Thorns also being up there. Lugia took a bit of a hit, perhaps because that Iron Thorns presence was a little bit larger. Um, Dragapult still being present, low percentage. Cloth making an appearance, and we'll get more into that in just a moment. Pidgeot Control showing up here. Some more Palkia decks, Roaring Moon, and rounding it out with a single Lost Box deck, which I believe is Sablezard.
Yeah, this tournament was basically uh, what is it like a fourth or a fifth of the size of the one in
Sure.
Europe. It's only had
Yeah.
578 players versus 2,000 something for Dortmund.
Right.
So yeah, we're definitely seeing the cuts a little more tighter, and I think that does make matchups more important. Like you have to kind of like you said, like there's always a Brazil contingent of playing Charizard, so that might factor into your decision to play like an Iron Thorn instead of play like an anti-meta like Snorlax has a really good Charizard matchup. So I can see where some players are like, hey, these guys are always playing Charizard. We need to kind of figure something else out.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, going into the whole breakdown here, that's kind of where you see some of these decks like the Cloth, the Snorlax, all of that come into play.
Right. Now, honestly, I'm actually not sure if there was an asymmetrical cut at this event. So for the sake of that, I'm just going to look at top 8. We do see Lugia winning the event, piloted by Yurko Valencia.
I'll look real quick while you're talking.
Sure. Following that, we have Giovanni Sasso with another Terapagos Dusknoir deck. And the Cloth that I mentioned earlier, we have Alejandro Luciano Ejo coming in with Cloth Electrode, a deck that most people still consider to be a meme, but maybe has a place here because it's a fighting type that can one-hit KO Terapagos as a one-prizer. And if you've got a large Terapagos presence, maybe Cloth is the answer to that. Rounding out top 4, we've got another Dusknoir Terapagos deck. Iron Thorns and Snorlax start off our top 8, followed by a Charizard Pidgeot, and rounding that out with another Raging Bolt deck.
Yep, and Nico Galas did make the asymmetrical with the same match point as Antonio here. So we did have one more.
So we had one playoff here. Presumably it was Antonio versus Nicholas. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, I just wasn't sure if Antonio was 8th seed going into Top Cut.
Yes. Actually, let me look. It's actually Giovanni Sasso.
Okay, so it was a Terapagos mirror in the asymmetrical round.
Yep.
So we'll start off. We've got the Lugia list that won the event, probably by Yurko Valencia. And we see some of that Wellspring tech that you said Rahul had mentioned as a potential option in the deck, as well as the Thornton that we saw from the other top 8 list from Dortmund. So there's kind of some cross-referencing here, some interplay that we don't see from everyone else. We don't see the inclusion of the Squawkabilly. We see Great Ball still being maintained in the deck. So there's some definite changes here. The deck, I feel like, without the Squawkabilly, I feel like you have a hard time discarding Archeops early consistently. Obviously, still worked out for Yurko here, but I'm not sure if that's correct. I think Squawkabilly is probably the play.
It's interesting. I don't know that discarding Chops is harder. It might be in some ways, but I can say that like with the Great Balls, you definitely have better chances of getting Chops in hand to do that.
Sure.
So that might have been the decision he made. Or like I think the goal of every Lugia player I've seen is like just playing the game, right? Like if you're able to set up, you're the best deck in the room. Like you have the best just raw power out of any deck. So like just I think that's the idea with Squawkabilly is if you just have a nest ball, that just allows you to play the game because you can squawk, and even if you have to discard 3 energy, you're still doing something as opposed to not having a supporter for turn and just passing.
Sure. Right, that's fair. Like I said, the other thing to call out here is obviously the Wellspring Ogerpon gives you a sniping option, another legacy energy attacker, and potentially sob trap somebody with a double turbo. So it's got a place. It's kind of something that people have always considered in or out of Lugia decks ever since it was released.
Yeah, you can get some cute little, the snipe attack, when it does 120 to the active and 120 to the bench. So that's really, it comes up more than you would think, especially as people start to cut mana fee from their decks.
Sure. Next up, we have the Terapagos Dusknoir from Giovanni Sasso, which this list looks more like what I envisioned people bringing to these events this weekend. With a thicker Noctowl line, I like the 101 Pidgeot in the deck a lot, especially if you have Thornton to back it up. I like 3 Duskull in these decks a lot. I think I would still like to see a Dusclops in here, but a lot of these numbers fit more in line with what I was expecting to see from these decks. The one takeaway I did have, we didn't really look at a lot of the other Terapagos lists from day 2 in Dortmund, but a lot of people made the decision to really, really slim down their supporter lines to the point that a lot of them were only running 1 copy of Professor's Research, maybe 2 Ionos, and then 1 of every other supporter. and some of them would play a pal pad to compensate for that. But you expect that you're going to win a lot of your games within your first 3, maybe 4 turns anyway, so you really don't need that many supporters, especially when you can just search for them with Noctowl or Pidgeot. So seeing them be so thick here, I guess Giovanni really just wants to make sure that he can get into the game and set up as consistently as possible. Can't really blame somebody for doing that. But you see some of the concessions that were made, like the cutting of that Dusclops or the choice here to play Energy Lotto rather than Chorus Tenacity.
I like that.
Just wanting to commit that supporter line to Iono or Research for the turn instead. And just a little bit slimmed down on the consistency cards as far as ball search goes. I like the Vitality Band in the deck.
Yeah, I saw that.
Either Vitality or Defiance. I think you play one of those band cards just to try to give yourself some sort of damage modifier to get over that 220 hump.
230, yeah.
Right. Or get beyond that 220 cap.
To get over the hump. Gotcha.
Yeah, I think that, some combination of this, I don't know if the perfect 60 has been found yet, but I think by Louisville we may see it. Maybe.
Yeah, it's definitely if you're playing the deck, I definitely would go back and say, look at Tords, look at all the ones that were in top 8, top 16, and kind of just go from there and just start testing out different ideas and have a notepad of hey, cut this, bring in this, cut this, bring in that, and go from there.
Right. Next up, we'll look at a lot of people's favorite deck. I know that our mutual friend Ian absolutely loves this deck. I don't know why, but Cloth Electrode still
how can you
trying
not like Cloth, dude?
Still kicking around in 2024 somehow. And like I said earlier when we were talking about this, the thing that you're taking advantage of now are that a lot of people expected Charizard to pop back up. So you've got the Hisuian Electrode V with the super effective glasses to be able to one-hit KO that. You have Cloth that takes advantage of a lot of these turbo decks, honestly, especially because of that Binding Mochi. You can one-hit KO Ogre Pawns after Poison is accounted for. You one-hit KO anything weak to fighting. And you can sometimes donk some of these evolving decks with that promo Petra run. So, Cloth's got some interesting options. The thing that scares me looking at this deck is just the sheer number of tool cards that you play that could lead to you having totally unplayable hands.
Yeah, it's 11 tools.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
Yeah, it's a pile of cards for sure. It is just so wild to see when you put it in paper. You're running all these cards that are just goofy, dude. The Hisuian, Radiant Hisuian Sneasler, the Promo Petulant, the Brute Bonnet. They're all just I would expect this to be at a league challenge, but here it is in top 4 of regionals.
Right.
It has power. Cloth is a one prize attacker that can hit for huge amounts of damage. Fighting weakness is really good right now. I know you know that playing Radiant or playing Greninja EX, you found that out in Baltimore. And there's just so many cool plays you can do with this. If your opponent takes the knockout and is still poisoned, you can put up the Petulant and kind of take cheesy KOs with that. And Poison's kind of cool if you get the knockout with Poison as opposed to, taking a knockout with damage. Pheasantipity doesn't activate because it's going into your turn as opposed to on your opponent's turn. So you get a lot of cool play with that. So there's just some really interesting thoughts. It's going to be a fun deck. I think we'll see this kind of pop up from time to time. I don't think it'll ever, be a top 4 or 5 meta share deck ever.
No,
but
I don't think so either. I think that a lot of Cloth's success is going to depend pretty heavily on the success of Terapagos or other fighting weak cards. Because I think if you walk into a room full of Lugia, you're probably not having a good day.
Yeah, I can see
that. Next up, we've got another Terapagos list. And this, okay, no, this is the same list. So 4th and 2nd place ran identical 60s. I have to imagine that they're testing partners. We already went over this deck, though. It's pretty cool to see 2 people running the same 60 make top 4 in an event, though.
Yeah, very cool. It's a fun car ride home.
Right? This is a more standard Iron Thorns deck. From Matthias here, we see the inclusion of the Enhanced Hammer for the Terapagos. Yeah, other than that, we jump back to Prime Catcher being the ace spec of choice. I think a lot of this just looks like
This
this
looks
is what
very
I would
similar
expect
to
Iron. This
Worlds.
is what I would expect Iron Thorns to be in this format.
Mm-hmm.
3 Cologne is interesting, actually.
Oh, that is
Maybe expecting
interesting.
control decks or adapting to the fact that a lot of control decks have been playing 3 Mimikyu to try to counter Iron Thorns.
You're just like, anything you can do, I can just the one-upmanship, just keep leveling, yeah. But yeah, this looks very similar to the Worlds list from
Yeah.
And
next,
that guy was from Chile, so that does make sense that we see a decent similar the way that played out.
Next up, we've got a heavy handheld fan. Snorlax stall list. I'm not a stall player by any means. I think the Chi-Yu is interesting right now. It might be a good call.
It's played in almost every Snorlax or every Pidgeot control list. So yeah, it is interesting to see in a Snorlax style. But I mean, it was played like a Zul's list when he won Stockholm.
Right.
I think he played Chi-Yu. So yeah, I think sometimes you need to close out the game a little faster than just the Misfortune Sisters. Was it?
Yeah.
Any of that. So.
A pretty standard fare Charizard deck. I know that there's been a lot of discussion this week for is this the right direction to take Charizard? A lot of people are questioning why are we thinning our Charizard lines down? Is Dusknoir actually good in this deck? Is this? I mean, we don't even see Briar in this list, so you can't even make the argument that you're trying to do prize shenanigans to make Briar function on the turn. So I'm wondering. Thornton, I totally understand the inclusion of because you want to be able to recover a Charmander if they're all knocked out on a given turn and still get a Charizard out. But if you're doing the bread and butter, I want to get Charizard on turn 2, is the right way to do that by maximizing your consistency in playing 4 Charmander and 3 Charizard. I don't know. I haven't put a lot of time into it right now. I think it's something that's worth exploring, though.
Yeah, 5 Fire is interesting. I don't think I've seen a count that low. I think it's mostly been 6. The Mist, I guess, is for Roaring Moon, and then the rest of it makes sense. Yeah, I can see
Max Belt is interesting.
Yeah, it's not unheard of in Charizard, but yeah, definitely.
Sure.
I guess the logic is if there's a lot of Terapagos, you're like, I have an answer for it turn 1, or turn 2 rather, without having to use Dusknoir. So that's kind of nice.
Rounding out top 8, we have our first Raging Bolt from Joinville. And this just looks like a straight charmless Raging Bolt, except for the inclusion of Crispin, which I've seen people talk about here and there as the 5th Sada for the deck. Also see the exclusion of a 1-prizer. So this list is more so forcing your opponent to go to that 2/2/2 so you can use Briar every game if you want to.
Yeah, this is the list I lost to in my cup. So it's kind of
okay. So you're really familiar with it.
Basically, I think Johnny ran the new Raging Bolt basic non-EX
the 1-prizer? Okay.
Sure. Yeah, Johnny always has to put his own little spin on stuff. But yeah, he ran the Crispin as well. And he was just saying, yeah, it's just a 5th Professor Sada's Vitality. Like, yeah, it's hard to argue with that. Like, if you sometimes you just want to see energy, you just want to attach energy every turn. Like, that's all you want to do. Even if you're not getting that extra draw effect, you don't really need it too much once your hand gets built up to a certain size.
Yeah. I can get behind that. And then, like you said, rounding out our asymmetrical top cut, we've got another Tropicos Dusknoir. And this still looks relatively similar to the 2 lists that made top 4, aside from we've got the inclusion of the Jet Energy here. The Pidgeot line is thicker. The Noctowl line is thinner. I really am a fan of 4 Hoot Hoot in this deck.
Yeah, if you're going to run that many, you might as like if you're not running like any other I guess you run the Pidgeot still. so it's not
Yeah,
unheard of.
yeah. No, so we've got, like I said,
It's a
like
thicker Pidgeot.
thinner Noctowl, thicker Pidgeot.
Yeah.
Personally, I'm a fan of 4 Hoot regardless of what your Noctowl count is. Even if I think you could run a 4-2 and still effectively say I'm going to discard this and Night Stretcher it back. Maybe that's a stretch, but I think 4-3 is a pretty good spot. 4-4 might be even better, just to be able to get around not having to discard it. But a lot of this, there's nothing really that stands out here as well. We've got the inclusion of that jet energy, I guess, is something that we could talk about real quick. A lot of people have been putting this in the Terapagos deck to give you a switch out, or to give your fan Rotom the ability to take a prize on like a Charmander or something on turn 2, rather than having to commit a Terapagos. So you give your opponent the situation where they have to present you with a Gust in addition to taking out have to present you with a Gust if they want to follow up and take out a Terapagos as a response.
Yeah, I don't know. It's like one of those cards where I see it and I'm like, it looks cool. I haven't really tested this deck as much as I want to, but it's one of those things. Like, does it really help your control matchup? Maybe. Does it really help? Like, I don't know. Well, like, what is it really helping you win?
Right.
Because it
Right.
doesn't really help you attack more. Maybe
No.
like you said with the Rotom, it's kind of a cool play, but it definitely is like a supplemental. Like, if you're doing that, are you really wanting to do that, or is it you're doing it because that's the only thing you have? Like if you had
Sure.
a double turbo, you would just rather be doing that with Terapagos.
Like you just mentioned control, the one argument I could see, and you'd have to kind of retool the supporters to make this work, but you could play like a Jet, a Penny, a Silene, and a Palpad to go through, like, I'm going to beat control with this deck, and I'm going to Jet up my Rotom or a Terapagos, and then Penny the Jet and the Terapagos back to my hand, and then I can Silene my Penny back in, and Palpad the Silene, and like, okay, cool, we've got our control matchup locked down. I don't know if they really need to go to that length to make that work, but there are definitely scenarios where the Jet can be helpful. I know that most people don't play it though.
Yeah, yeah, it is an interesting thing to think. It's good to keep in mind. Like as I was talking about, I forgot. Like Blood Moon, like you can reset the attack on
Sure,
that
absolutely.
with a like switch or a prime catcher, and then Jet Energy to back up for a game. So like, that's pretty good.
Right. So yeah, that closes out our 2 regionals for the weekend. The next thing that we wanted to do is transition into a segment that we're, at least for now, calling Time Capsule, where we're going to take a look back at some of the more retro decks, given that John and I are both old, and we're going to go back and start at the beginning of the Nintendo era. The deck that I've picked out for this week is Chris Fulop's 2004 second place World's Blaziken deck. And so for those of you who are unfamiliar with older decks or just retro Pokemon in general, you'll look at this list and it'll look really weird. There are a ton of supporters in here and not very many item cards. And how does this deck even work? And the thing that you'll eventually realize if you ever actually get the chance to sit down and play with some of these older decks, games took a lot longer. The rules were a little bit different then as well. You could attack on turn 1, but you couldn't play a supporter and things like that. So you would see things like this Dunsparce from the Sandstorm set be included as what we called starter Pokemon. And Dunsparce's attack would let you search for 3 basic Pokemon, put them on your bench, and then you could switch Dunsparce if you wanted to. Most of the time, people just left it active. But that would let you go find like 2 Torchics and a Skitty, or 2 Torchics and an Electrike, something to help your deck get set up. And instead of our draw and search being powered by item cards, everything would either be onboard abilities for draw or using supporters to draw cards. And so we've got some supporters in this deck. We've got the Oracle, which functions exactly the same as Cypher Maniac's Code Breaking. That would be comboed with the Ruby Sapphire Delcatty's Energy Draw to allow you to draw 3 cards by discarding an energy from your hand. That energy would in turn be recovered by the Ruby Sapphire Blaziken's Firestarter ability, which functions very similarly to any host of abilities that we've seen throughout the game. We've got the Electric from Dark Explorers. I'm sure that there's one that I'm blanking on. That
Yeah,
it's
the
kind of like Psychic
Malamar
Embrace.
from I don't know.
For modern Pokemon,
Psychic
it's
Malamar.
probably the most similar to Psychic Embrace, except you could only put it on a bench Pokemon and it wouldn't damage them. But I digress. To get around the fact that you could only put them on bench Pokemon, Chris included Team Aqua's Manectric. This was pretty much a mainstay in this deck with the Power Shift Pokepower that would allow you to move energy attached to one of your Team Aqua Pokemon to any of your other Pokemon. So you would Firestarter to your Manectric, and move the energy from Manectric to your attacker for the turn, which would either oftentimes be the Rayquaza EX, which just gave you your big one-hit KO ability. Its attack is very similar to Raging Bolt's attack, in that you would load up a bunch of energy on your board, blow all of the fires off, and one-hit KO whatever your opponent had active. Or you could attack with the Blaziken EX and use this Volcanic Ash attack, which would discard 2 fire energy to do 100 damage to any of your opponent's Pokemon. And while these damage numbers don't seem as impressive now, when we look at some of the fully evolved Stage 2 Pokemon from back in the day, you'd have a fully evolved Stage 2 that your opponent had to take the time to rare candy out or evolve manually up to, and they cap out at 100 HP. So you're knocking out a lot of things, not just little piddly one-prizers or basics. The other big inclusion for Chris's deck list at this time was the Blossom. I guess he had heard some rumblings, perhaps, of the Team Magma decks that Japan ended up bringing and winning Worlds with, and sought to counter that by including a grass attacker. But I know that one of the other reasons was for, I believe, the Walrein matchup. It kind of offsets some math by being able to heal itself and having resistance to water. The Walrein deck could literally never KO this Pokemon. And it's something that, some innovations like that you don't necessarily see all the time that can definitely pay off, especially when you have them show up at big tournaments like Worlds. One thing that I really wanted to call out here, and we don't get to see it too often nowadays, we did see it in Gardevoir 2 seasons ago before we had the rotation of the... Gosh, I'm blanking on what that ability was called. The non-EX Gardevoir. But
the Shining Arcana.
Thank you, Shining Arcana.
Yeah.
I like when evolution lines are able to split between the 2-prizer and non-2-prizer, and that's something that this deck does very well. I think that's really interesting.
Just as a reminder for those that aren't too familiar with this format, Rare Candy has a very different text than what we're used to right now.
Very true.
So it plays a lot different.
Honestly, if you look at it, the big thing that you may not notice at first is the exclusion of the clause that you cannot do at the turn the card that the Pokemon was put down.
Right.
And so the thing that you were able to do was Rare Candy into Stage 2s on turn 1, which in this deck isn't that big of a deal. But the fact that you could do it also the turn you put a card down meant that even if your opponent was able to wipe all of your Torchics off the board, you could Rare Candy out of Stage 2 and still kind of get your deck rolling from there. As I mentioned before, we don't have as much item-based search, so we had to go search out our Pokemon using the Strike and Run attack, or just by drawing them by using Oracle and Energy Draw to draw into Pokemon, or using cards like Steven's Advice, which is very similar to the current Morty's Conviction card. You just draw cards equal to the number of Pokemon your opponent has in play. You can't use it if you have more than 7 cards in your hand. We had Copycat. Hand sizes would often get very large in this format because Delcatty was included in several decks, along with the Magneton from the EX Dragon set that would let you discard a card from your hand to put 2 energies back into your hand, and kind of worked in tandem with Delcatty in a lot of lists to be able to discard a card, put energy back in your hand, discard the energy, draw 3 cards, and you could see just from that's plus 4 cards to your hand plus 3 for no, resource input as far as not playing your supporter for the turn. It's very powerful, but ends up giving you a giant glut of cards in your hand. Your opponent could say, okay, my hand's not very good. I'm going to Copycat, shuffle my hand and draw 8 cards. This deck's a lot of fun. It's very versatile. It's something that if you're revisiting the format, I would definitely recommend picking this up. And when we get into our next session of this segment, I think that we'll probably revisit another deck from this format, perhaps one of that Magma lists that won the event, or maybe something else. We'll have to see. I don't know. John's going to pick something interesting, I think.
Oh yeah, I'm not quite well versed in this format, so it's awesome to see some of this stuff. And I was just counting the Pokemon lineup while you're going over all this. We see, I think, 24 Pokemon in here, so almost like a good 3/5 or 2/5 of your deck is Pokemon, I guess.
Sure.
Quick math. I'm sorry.
A lot of that ends up being off the back of, like I said, there were starter Pokemon back in this format. So we have 4 of this Dunsparce rather than including 4 Nest Ball in the deck, and so you get a nice trade off in that regard.
Yeah.
And just the fact that you look at this, that the trainer section is so thin compared to a modern Pokemon deck that that space has to go somewhere. And
Yeah.
in this list, it gets divvied up pretty healthily between the energy count.
Yeah, it's very themed deck like where you have the 20, but yeah, not quite. You still have more Pokemon, very thin comparatively to the modern form, like standard format now, and then yeah, a
Right.
pretty decent amount of energy. I mean,
I think that as the game has evolved, energy has gotten smaller, Pokemon have often gotten smaller, and trainers have just become more and more and more of a percentage of a deck's makeup. But hopefully that taught you something about the deck. I know I rambled a little bit there. It's kind of hard to touch on every single thing that you could with this deck without really covering the format as a whole. So, with that being said, we're going to
yeah,
kind of close out this episode by just talking about what do we think of the results of those two regionals and how are they going to affect the upcoming Louisville regional here in North America?
it's a good question. I think it's always fun to look at the first two tournaments coming into a new format to see what people come up with. And my takeaways are like there really wasn't a whole lot of you know archetypes coming out of Stellar Crown. We had
Sure.
Terapagos, and that's about it. There
Right.
wasn't really like we had Hydrapple being hyped up a little bit. Like Pokemon TCG Live always gives you like cards to start out with at the start of the ladder for the new month or the new set that comes out, and they gave you Terapagos, but then they like gave you a Galvantula deck, and people were trying
Right.
to build Hydrapple, and I mean it's just like it's one of those sets where I don't know. It feels like Obsidian Flames, where there's like that one thing that's good, and then the rest of it's just like bulk. Like, and there's some, it's not complete trash. It's not complete garbage. I don't think it's that. It's a little too drastic to say that. But like we saw that reflected in tournament results, where most of the top 8 decks, other than Terapagos, all of them were stuff we've already seen before. So I think as a new player coming into the game or continuing to play this game, it definitely can be a little discouraging. But I don't think that we've seen the end of this set. We haven't definitely seen the end of this format. I think like there's still innovation to be had within Terapagos, still innovation to have with a lot of these Dusknoir decks. I'm seeing kind of the rise of those, the innovation with that, as people figure out what's like. We looked at all these Dusknoir decks; they're all running different Dusknoir lines. They're like 3-1-2, 2-0-2, 3-0-2, one one
Sure.
one, 2-1-1, like all these crazy like. There's no like standard way to run it, and I think that's kind of cool to me. It's trying to figure out how does your deck go forward with the information that you have from these two tournaments. And yeah, I'm excited to see kind of the innovations that we see going into Louisville. Um, so my question, if I just touched on Dusknoir, my question to you is, what's the best deck to partner with Dusknoir right now? I know you were big into Palkia Dusknoir
That's
at
a bit of a loaded
Baltimore.
question.
Well, but do you think it's so? I'll say, do you think it's better than Terapagos Dusknoir?
I'm going to be totally biased in this answer, but I do.
Okay,
I do because I think the deck is more versatile overall. I
sure.
think that Terapagos does one thing. It does that thing very well. And I think that it being able to take advantage of this new Noctowl engine. I know that you mentioned a lot of the marquee cards in the set, the EXs, were kind of more, unfortunately, bulk cards. They're just kind of there. They're shiny. They're not very good. But this is a very support heavy set. And we see that Noctowl engine being added with the Jewel Seeker Noctowl, with the Fan Rotom, with the Area Zero Underdepths to let you go wide with all these Terra Pokemon. And the card that they want to support with all of that is Terapagos. And being able to attack for a single energy card is very, you know, beneficial. Being able to thin your deck down because you only have to include 3 or 4 energy cards, so you can fit all these other things in. Getting access to Pidgeot is very nice, but I think what the deck lacks that the Palkia deck has are it does the one thing. It only hits your active unless I'm popping a Dust Noir to hit your bench. Whereas with Palkia, you can attack for multiple types, so you can hit multiple weaknesses. You have the ability to hit bench Pokemon either with the Terra Greninja EX or with Radiant Greninja. And if you're playing against an Area Zero deck, you can just hit huge numbers with Palkia. Especially if you get to activate that Area Zero by rare candying out the Greninja EX. So I think in a lot of ways it ends up being potentially more high rolly and maybe it's a little bit less consistent because you're having to use Pokestop as part of your engine rather than using Noctowl. but I think the ceiling of the deck is higher. That being said, I think it's going to have a lower play rate because a lot of top players don't like to play what they would consider high roll decks. They would rather play the consistent thing. So they're going to play like your Regidragos or your Terapagos, or back when it was more powerful, they would play Charizard because they know they have confidence that they can do the thing and they memorize their flowchart or their lines of play to where they can do the same thing every time without having to rely on any level of randomization whatsoever. A lot of top players tend to shy away from randomization. People hate coin flip cards because they feel like they want to control the outcome of their game. And I think a lot of times Pokestop kind of fits into that category as well.
Yeah. Did it surprise you to see Stefan Ivanov playing it top 4?
I thought it was really interesting that the list was as close to what we arrived at. But did it surprise me? No, I think the deck's very powerful. If anything, it made me more excited than anything. I was super hyped when Tuan was on stream on day one, and then to find out that, and it also kind of didn't surprise me when I found out that Tuan was testing with Stefan, that Stefan would arrive at a somewhat similar list, at least because I imagine he started at the same base that I did by discovering Hare's list from Japan. I know Tuan's got a lot of Japanese contacts, does a lot of translations for the community.
Yeah, and Stefan is really into, I think, alternate format stuff.
Yeah, I know he's big on expanded.
Yeah, so it doesn't surprise me that he's trying to innovate with off the wall kind of stuff. Like he's more comfortable doing crazy stuff than the average player. So that kind of makes sense a little bit. But just kind of going from Guardia Worlds to now using the kind of Dustnor engine, I think was kind of cool to see.
Yeah, the one thing I will say, like I said, I don't think that Palkia is going to see a big spike in play because of Stefan's result. I think more people would gravitate toward the Terapagos decks because you saw more big name players playing them, even though the Palkia deck did finish higher, because they're going to say, oh, well, a lot of it's going to ride on the back of Tord played this deck. And it coming in second at Joinville is going to play into people's minds as well. I do think we're going to see a big spike in Terapagos, which also means that we should see a big spike, I feel, in Palkia, because I feel like, especially with that Terra Greninja EX, it's got a lot of good plays into Terapagos. Being able to do something like Mirage Barrage and take 3 or more prizes in a given turn is really hard to not want to do. But we could see some response from some of these Terapagos decks being able to potentially block some of those plays in other ways.
Yeah, it's a cool question. I definitely want to see how like Louisville's meta shakes out. I definitely will expect more Terapagos than
absolutely
Palkia Dustnor. Even if there's a higher power level, I think people just, like you said, aren't afraid or are not afraid, but people don't like Pokestop decks all that much.
Right.
And I get it. Just feels crappy to like. I mean, I guess people like Raging Bolt, but I don't know. Top players don't. So
right.
Anyway, all right. The next question I had for you. So, what decks are you looking forward to playing now that you've seen these results? Like you have an hour between tasks, and you have to boot up live. What deck are you playing after watching?
I'm probably still just jamming Palkia Dustnor.
Dang, dude! Oh, really?
I haven't put it down. I've been just trying different cards in the deck. Honestly, if I pull up my TCG Live deck roster, I think I have 8 variations of the deck built, and most of them obviously they're only different by like 1 or 2 cards, but just different things, just trying things here and there. The deck's a lot of fun. But I'm going to turn that back around. I'm going to turn that back around to you then. What do you want to play most following these 2 events?
I mean, the first deck I saw, I love the Dragapult deck by Ryuki. I definitely want to play that. I think I watched a little bit of his little stream today. He was playing that, and I'm definitely like, oh yeah, let me get my lines figured out with that. Just having the more like, having it's a little more. You have to get your combo pieces. You don't have Pidgeot, so you have to kind of draw into stuff and get your rare candy and find your ways to like win. So it's a little more thought intensive, I say, than just quick search, get whatever you need to win the game.
Sure.
But I think that's cool. I think that rewards good sequencing, good play. I'm excited to play that. And I'll probably build Cloth at some point to just have fun. I might build it for like a league deck and bring it to Pokemon League and kind of if a new player wants to come and play against Cloth, that's always fun. They're like always like anytime you're using status conditions in the TCG, I think that makes it fun.
Yeah, that's true. That's
So
true.
you get into, and you get the supplemental damage from Hisuian Sneasler from the Petulant promo. So it's a fun little. I mean, it's not little, but it's a fun deck for sure. But those are probably the two that come to the top of my mind.
Cool. Well, hey, we'd love to hear from you. What decks following these two events are you interested in playing? So let us know down in the comments of this episode, or we'll have a link to the Discord where you could come reach out to us and interact with us if that's something you're interested in doing. And with that being said, John, I think that we've kind of covered everything we wanted to cover this week. Did you have any final thoughts before we close things out?
Nope. Thanks for doing a great podcast with me. I'm excited to keep doing this in the future. Learn a lot of cool retro stuff and kind of have some good moments talking. Some segments I want to feature in the future. I want to look at the CP leaderboard for North America. I've been keeping track of that, just teasing that. So definitely be on the lookout for that in the lead up to Louisville. Hopefully, we'll get an episode up before Louisville, going into the meta for that, and then going into the CP leaderboard and all the implications from the last few months. It's the end of the season will be here before you know it, and it's always cool to keep kind of track of who's doing what and how they're moving, how it's shaking. So
Sure,
excited to
absolutely.
keep it going, have a little adventure on the Battle Frontier.
Sounds great to me. So, hey, look forward to that. And like John said, we'll look forward to seeing you on our next adventure in the Battle Frontier.